Have you ever wondered what medieval paganism truly looked like? For centuries, our understanding has been shaped by narratives crafted by their Christian adversaries, academic simplifications, and modern reimaginings. The reality is far more complex and fascinating than most people realize. In 786 CE, as Charlemagne's armies pushed deeper into Saxon territory, they encountered fierce resistance from local tribes. These pagans, as Christian chroniclers called them, fought not just for their land but for their entire way of life. Among these defenders was Harald Irminsson, a respected elder and keeper of traditional knowledge among his people. "They will not just take our land," Harald warned his kinsmen as they gathered in a woodland clearing. "They will take our gods, our stories, and the very meaning we give to the world." Harald's fears were well-founded. The chronicles of the Frankish Empire record that after conquering the Saxons, Charlemagne ordered the destruction of the Irminsul, a sacred pillar or tree trunk of immense religious significance to the Saxon tribes. This act of cultural devastation was followed by the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae in 782 CE, which demanded death for any Saxon who refused baptism or continued practicing traditional rites. Yet what were these pagan practices that warranted such brutal suppression? This is where the historical record becomes clouded by the biases of those who wrote it. Medieval paganism was not a monolithic religion, but rather a diverse collection of indigenous European belief systems that varied significantly by region, tribe, and landscape. These traditions were primarily oral, with knowledge passed down through generations in the form of stories, songs, and rituals. Unlike the centralized doctrines of Christianity, these belief systems were adaptable, practical, and deeply rooted in local environments. Leona Ravensdottir, a noblewoman from a Norse settlement in northern England around 950 CE, navigated this changing religious landscape with remarkable pragmatism. Historical records from the period reveal that many Norse settlers officially converted to Christianity while maintaining various traditional practices. Archaeological evidence from Leona's estate, discovered in the 1980s, shows a household that outwardly embraced Christian symbols while continuing to honor ancestral customs. Christian crosses were displayed prominently, yet beneath floorboards, archaeologists found carefully preserved amulets of Thor's hammer. Church attendance records list her family as faithful parishioners, yet excavations of her property revealed outdoor spaces clearly designed for seasonal celebrations that followed the pre-Christian calendar. "The new God has his place in our hall," Leona reportedly told her children, according to a chronicle written by a local monk, "but the old gods still guard our fields and forests." This practical accommodation represents a historical reality rarely discussed in simplified narratives. The conversion of Europe was not a clean break, but rather a gradual transformation that often incorporated earlier beliefs rather than erasing them entirely. One of the most persistent misconceptions about medieval paganism concerns its relationship with the natural world. Modern interpretations often romanticize pre-Christian Europeans as proto-environmentalists who lived in perfect harmony with nature. The historical record tells a more nuanced story. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern Europe dating from 500–1000 CE reveals communities that both venerated and exploited natural resources. Pollen analysis from bog bodies and settlement sites demonstrates that these societies actively transformed their landscapes through deforestation, agriculture, and mining, sometimes causing significant environmental damage. What distinguished their worldview was not an absence of environmental impact, but rather a cosmology that recognized spiritual presences within natural features and creatures. Rivers, mountains, forests, and animals were not merely resources, but entities with their own agency and power that required respect and negotiation. The Domesday Book of 1086, William the Conqueror's Great Survey of England, contains curious references to lands set aside for old observances near many villages. Evidence that nearly 20 years after the Norman conquest, local communities still maintained sacred groves and ritual spaces outside the Christian framework. Harald witnessed the systematic dismantling of this worldview firsthand. After Charlemagne's conquest, Christian missionaries arrived in Saxon territories with clear instructions to reframe the indigenous understanding of the natural world. Where Saxons once saw sacred presences requiring reciprocal relationships, the new religion taught that nature was a creation to be dominated by mankind according to divine mandate. They tell us our sacred oak is merely wood, Harald lamented to his grandson in 789 CE, as recorded in the marginalia of a missionary's journal. But when I stand beneath its branches, I still hear the whispers of our ancestors. Another area where historical understanding has been distorted concerns violence and sacrifice in pre-Christian Europe. Popular imagination, fueled by sensationalized accounts and modern entertainment, often depicts pagans as bloodthirsty practitioners of human sacrifice. The archaeological and textual evidence presents a far more complex picture. While human sacrifice did occur in some pre-Christian European societies, it was neither universal nor as prevalent as Christian polemics claimed. The most reliable archaeological evidence comes from bog bodies discovered across northern Europe, some of which show signs of ritual killing. However, these represent exceptional circumstances rather than regular practice, often associated with times of crisis or special ritual significance. Adam of Bremen's account from the 1070s describing human sacrifice at the temple at Uppsala in Sweden is frequently cited as evidence of widespread sacrificial practices. Yet modern historians note that Adam never visited Uppsala himself, and his account contradicts archaeological evidence from the site. His description likely served political purposes in justifying continued missionary efforts. More common were animal sacrifices and offerings of food, drink, and valuable goods at sacred sites, practices documented through archaeological findings across Europe. At Leona's estate, excavations revealed ritual deposits of valuable items at boundary markers and field edges, evidence of offerings to ensure good harvests and protection. The priests claim we bathed in blood, Leona once remarked to a Christian neighbor, according to local records from 963 CE. In truth, we offered mead and bread to the land that feeds us, and sometimes a beast from our herds in times of greatest need. Perhaps the most significant distortion in our understanding of medieval paganism concerns its political structures. Christian accounts often portrayed pre-conversion societies as primitive, lacking sophisticated governance. Archaeological and historical evidence reveals sophisticated systems that differed from, rather than fell short of, Christian political organization. The Thing, a governing assembly in Norse and Germanic societies, represented a form of participatory governance where free men, and sometimes women of high status, could speak and influence community decisions. While not democratic in the modern sense, these assemblies provided more widespread participation in governance than the hierarchical feudal systems that replaced them. Iceland's Althing, established in 930 CE, stands as the world's oldest parliamentary institution and grew directly from pre-Christian governance traditions. Even after Iceland's official conversion to Christianity in 1000 CE, the Althing preserved many aspects of earlier governance while incorporating new Christian elements. In Harald's Saxon community, leadership was distributed among a council of elders rather than centralized in a single ruler, a system that Charlemagne's chroniclers described as chaotic, but which archaeological evidence suggests was highly effective at managing resources and resolving disputes. The Franks believe a man must bow to one master, Harald observed to his council in 785 CE, shortly before their defeat. We have always known that wisdom resides in many voices speaking together. This decentralized governance posed a significant challenge to Charlemagne's imperial ambitions. Distributed authority made conquest difficult. There was no single leader who could surrender on behalf of all. This explains the particular brutality of his Saxon campaigns, including the infamous massacre of Verdun in 782 CE, where an estimated 4,500 Saxon leaders were executed in a single day. The intellectual and scientific dimensions of pre-Christian European societies have been similarly underappreciated. While Christian monasteries undoubtedly preserved crucial knowledge through the early medieval period, indigenous knowledge systems contained sophisticated understanding of astronomy, medicine, agriculture, and metallurgy. Archaeological findings from the 7th to 10th centuries reveal that pre-Christian communities across northern Europe maintained accurate solar and lunar calendars that guided agricultural activities and religious observances. The Nebra sky disk, created around 1600 BCE but kept and used for generations, demonstrates sophisticated astronomical knowledge that continued to influence medieval Northern European societies. In medicine, archaeological and textual evidence reveals extensive knowledge of herbal remedies. Analysis of medical compounds found in Saxon settlements shows effective treatments for common ailments. The 10th century Bald's Leech Book, an Anglo-Saxon medical text, contains remedies that blend Christian prayers with clearly pre-Christian herbal knowledge. Modern laboratory testing has confirmed the efficacy of some of these treatments, including an eye salve that proves effective against antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Leona maintained such knowledge in her household. Court records from 968 CE describe local villagers seeking her assistance with ailments even after the establishment of a monastery with its own infirmary nearby. "The monks have their prayers," she reportedly told a patient, "but I have the knowledge of which plant answers which affliction, as my mother taught me and her mother before her." The gender dimensions of religious conversion represent another aspect of history that deserves greater attention. Women often experience the shift from indigenous practices to Christianity differently than men, sometimes losing significant social and religious authority. Archaeological and historical evidence indicates that women held important religious roles in many pre-Christian European societies. Grave goods from high-status female burials across Northern Europe include ritual items suggesting religious leadership. The Oseberg ship burial from 834 CE in Norway contained two women surrounded by elaborate ritual objects, suggesting high religious status. The conversion to Christianity typically centralized religious authority in an exclusively male priesthood. Historical records from the early medieval period show that women's religious leadership became increasingly marginalized, with female spiritual authority redirected into approved channels like convents under male church supervision. Leona's story illustrates this tension. Local chronicles note that before conversion, she led seasonal rituals for her community. After conversion, church authorities actively worked to redirect community reverence away from her and toward the parish priest. A letter from the regional bishop in 972 CE specifically condemns the continuing respect given to the woman Leona in matters that should be the province of ordained men of God. The relationship between literacy and religious change represents another area where our historical understanding needs revision. The spread of Christianity is often credited with bringing literacy to Northern Europe, but this narrative overlooks the existing systems of written communication. Runic inscriptions across Scandinavia and Germanic territories demonstrate pre-Christian literacy, with over 6,000 runic inscriptions discovered to date. While not used for long-form texts like Christian manuscripts, runes served important religious, commemorative, and practical functions. The shift from runes to Latin script was not simply an advancement in literacy, but also a transfer of intellectual authority. Knowledge previously accessible to local communities through runic writing became the domain of a specialized class of Latin literate clergy, often educated far from local concerns. Harald guarded a collection of runic knowledge stored on wooden tablets, none of which survived the systematic destruction of Saxon religious artifacts. "The priests say we live in darkness without their Latin books," he observed to his grandson, according to the same missionary's marginalia. "Yet our marks on wood have carried our stories and wisdom for generations." Perhaps most significantly, our understanding of conversion itself requires reconsideration. The traditional narrative presents the Christianization of Europe as primarily a matter of spiritual revelation, pagans recognizing the superiority of Christian theology. Historical evidence reveals a process far more entwined with political power, economic advantage, and sometimes outright violence. Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons represent the most explicit example of forced conversion, but subtler pressures operated throughout Europe. Laws increasingly disadvantaged those who maintained traditional practices. Trade networks became dominated by Christian merchants, creating economic incentives to convert. Marriage alliances required religious conformity. For many medieval Europeans, conversion was less a spiritual transformation than a practical adaptation to changing political realities. Archaeological evidence from across Northern Europe shows communities that outwardly adopted Christian practices while maintaining traditional beliefs in private spaces. The grave of a 9th-century Saxon warrior excavated near Bremen in 1976 contained both a Christian cross and traditional weapons arranged according to pre-Christian burial customs, material evidence of the complex religious identities many individuals maintained. Leona's approach represented this pragmatic adaptation. Church records from 975 CE, 3 years before her death, list her as a generous donor to the local church building fund. Yet her burial, revealed by archaeological excavation, included both Christian elements and traditional grave goods carefully hidden from official view. The process of religious change continued long after official conversion dates. The Church's ongoing struggle against superstition throughout the medieval period testifies to the persistence of pre-Christian practices. Church councils repeatedly condemned practices like leaving offerings at trees, wells, and stones, indicating their continued popularity despite centuries of official Christianity. Pope Gregory I's famous instruction to British missionaries in 601 CE recognized this reality, advising them to repurpose rather than destroy pagan temples. The people who meet to sacrifice cattle to demons should celebrate a religious feast of another kind. It is doubtless impossible to cut everything at once from their stubborn minds. This advice was followed across Europe, as evidenced by churches built atop earlier sacred sites and Christian festivals timed to coincide with pre-Christian observances. The Venerable Bede, writing in 725 CE, explicitly acknowledged that Christmas was scheduled to coincide with existing midwinter celebrations. What does this complex historical reality mean for our understanding today? First, it reminds us that history is rarely as simple as Winter's narratives suggest. The triumph of Christianity over paganism was neither complete nor exclusively the result of spiritual superiority. It involved political calculation, economic pressure, and sometimes brutal force alongside genuine spiritual conversion. Second, it challenges us to recognize that societies deemed primitive or superstitious often maintained sophisticated knowledge systems, governance structures, and ethical frameworks that were different from but not inferior to those that replaced them. Third, it demonstrates how religious change happens not through wholesale replacement, but through complex processes of adaptation, reinterpretation, and synthesis. Many elements of pre-Christian European culture survived within the framework of medieval Christianity, sometimes hidden, sometimes transformed, but never entirely erased. Finally, it reminds us that all historical narratives serve the interests of those who construct them. The portrayal of pre-Christian Europeans as primitive idol worshippers served medieval church authorities seeking to consolidate power. The romanticization of these same people as nature-worshipping proto-environmentalists serves modern spiritual seekers looking for alternatives to industrial society. Harald and Leona's stories, pieced together from fragmentary historical sources, remind us that real people navigated these religious transformations not as abstract theological debates, but as practical realities affecting their families, communities, and way of life. The gods changed their names and faces, Leona told her grandchildren in her final days, according to family stories later recorded by a 12th-century chronicler. But the land remains, and we remain upon it. Remember both what is written in the new books and what is whispered in the ancient stones. The true history of medieval paganism and its transformation reminds us that cultural change is never simple, that power shapes the stories we tell about the past, and that beneath official narratives lie complex human experiences of adaptation, resistance, and negotiation. Understanding this complexity not only corrects historical misconceptions, but helps us navigate our own era of rapid cultural and religious change with greater wisdom and compassion.